Welcome, everyone. I'm Ron Tocci. I'm the head of the Veteran Service Agency, privileged to serve. And I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for coming out this afternoon. I would ask everyone, if you can, to stand while our Honor Guard, County Police Department present the colors of our nation. Please join with me in pledging to our nation. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
Right face. Forward, on.
If you would please remain standing while I call on Reverend Erwin Lee Trollinger from the Calvary Baptist Church here in White Plains to deliver our invocation. Reverend?
As we prepare to pray, we remember the lives and the families of those who have blessed us with the sacrifice of giving themselves their talent, their skills so many centuries ago, but without their contributions to America and to the world, we wouldn't have this beautiful day in which we now stand to give honor to them. Let us bow our heads. Eternal God, the creator of heaven and in earth, of humanity and all of creation, once again we humbly bow ourselves to your will, your power, and your grace. We thank you, God, for this divine experiment that occurred some 200 odd years ago called the United States of America. And out of that experiment, many times you have called the sons and the daughters of this shore to fight in lands that liberty and justice may be sought in the lives of many people while we safeguarded our liberty here in these United States. May the names of those that will be called today, symbolically now planted by trees, always represent the fact that the trees are good for the healing of the nation. We pray, Father, for family members that may remember grandfathers, fathers, uncles, and great-grandfathers, and may their memories always be blessed and may they be remembered. And we ask you, Father, continue to allow your grace to be upon this land that we called America. And may we not only bless you, but may you bless us in all our deeds. Be with our armed services, wherever they may be in this world. Keep them safe by night and day. Make their families know your peace and your grace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Okay. Everybody could be seated. Thank you, Reverend. As we reflect back in pages of our history, we remember maybe when we were in school, it's over a century that World War I it comes to mind. And today, you'd have to be over 110 years old to remember anything, if you can remember. But at the same time, this community took the time and certainly wanted to mark in history the sacrifices and the service of special heroes that served in the Great War that was going to end all wars. Well, we know what that one did. Anyway, it was Woodrow Wilson who was the President of the United States at that particular time, and it was on November 11th, 1918, that ended hostilities in Europe. It was a time that everybody felt better things to come. I think it's important to understand the similarities in history. After that war, 1918, a pandemic broke out, influenza. And there were almost 1 million Americans who died of that disease. You think back to the population of the United States as opposed to what it is today, 10 times more people died of the pandemic that were killed in the battles. That's just phenomenal when you think of it. But America endured and went on, and hopefully they all believed things were going to get better. At the same time, there were special people that survived that served in that war. One in particular, Frank Buckles, he died at 110 years of age in 2011. Can you imagine? I think he's the oldest living veteran that we were able to identify. But memories fade very quick, and maybe after a couple of generations, people kind of forget what it's all about. And they tend to, on maybe a special day once a year, pay tribute and pay appreciation for the sacrifices for their country. But their gift of patriotism and life is obviously eternal. And I think it's the duty of all the succeeding generations to understand and appreciate, not only remember, but to pray for the souls of those people who are not with us anymore. And at the same time, to pass that torch on to the younger generation and make them understand what America is truly all about. I mean, we are in a chaotic time, as we all know right now, and it's difficult to get young people to understand what this country was founded for and what it's all about, because people aren't learning most of our history in school anymore, and they're getting it from TV, from a lot of pundits and a lot of propaganda on a lot of networks. So it's very, very difficult. So if there is an obligation for any of us, it's to teach our younger people what it's all about. And while it's still fresh in the minds of people, the wars that are going on, Afghanistan, Iraq, it's still technically at war with Afghanistan. I think it's so important today to make our young people understand and remember the words of Jack Kennedy. It's ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That kind of became almost archaic. Anyway, there are plaques here today that we are rededicating. Rededicating means that we're remembering again. A lot of things have happened, a lot of things that have been improved. Our county center wasn't even erected at the time, so monuments were placed with trees as memorials, and they had to be moved several times, but we were able to find the right people, namely our county exec, who took the advice of so many good veterans that have in their mind every day those people that serve our nation without question. So we are restoring those memorials as they should be, and we're asking people to see them, understand what they are, and explain to people who take the time to view them. Anyway, I want to thank especially my colleague in my office, Dan Griffin, for initiating this program, and he'll have a little bit more to say about that. So anyway, I want to introduce our special guest today, and someone who we think is certainly worthy of praise. Several of them, as a matter of fact. But the first one I'd like to talk about is Cynthia Abbott Kaufman, who's she's also the historian, president of the Westchester White Plains Historical Society, co-founder and president of the Daughters of Liberty Legacy, and the president of the American Legion Auxiliary. And she can share with us a little bit of the history of this monument. So Cynthia, if you're here, where are you? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining us here today. It has been over 100 years since these men we are here to honor today gave their lives in the Great War that we now call World War I. But before I begin, I'd like to thank every veteran here today. You have followed in the steps of every soldier who came before you and paved the way for those who serve now. You honored their service, and today we would like to honor yours. I want you to think back to White Plains during the time of the Great War and what life would have been like for you. In 1914, White Plains was not yet incorporated as a city. Americans walked most places, took a horse-drawn wagon, or in some cities, streetcars or trains. Automobile ownership was rare. Less than 1% of homes owned an auto. The train companies advertised the availability of affordable lots in White Plains where one could build a lovely home. 3 generations of family lived in homes that they rarely owned, ate almost as much lard as chicken, and spent Friday nights dancing to player pianos. But soon the United States would be drawn into the Great War in Europe. In April 1917, President Wilson stood before Congress and said the world must be made safe for democracy. With those words, he asked for a declaration of war, which Congress gave with gusto. For the first time in its history, the United States joined a coalition to fight a war not on its own soil or of its own making. White Plains' population was less than 16,000, but we sent 1,300 men to war. You likely would have known some of the young men from town who went off to serve over there. There was no television or instant way for people to know what was happening, like we have today. Even the radio was still considered a fad and not a way for anyone to receive news of the day. It was Edwin Armstrong's invention during World War I that made it possible to replace earphones with a loudspeaker. People feared a knock on the door or receiving a telegram that might say their loved one had lost his life in service to our country. World War I was one of the deadliest global conflicts in history. There were new weapons that had never been used before, like flamethrowers, poison gas, tanks, and grenades. An estimated 9 million soldiers were killed in combat, plus another 23 million wounded, and 5 million civilians died as a result of military action, hunger, and disease. Shortly, you will hear a poem called Flanders Fields that was written in 1915 when a Canadian doctor, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, was so moved by the death of a friend that he sat down at the Flanders Fields Cemetery in Belgium to gather his thoughts. It was there that he saw poppies growing between the rows of graves. That poem is read every Memorial Day, as red poppies are given out by American Legion Auxiliary members. Today we are here to honor 50 local men who served in the Great War. Some were born here, some were not, but all called White Plains their home when they went off to war and never returned home. As we remember them, we also need to remember their families who gave their beloved son, brother, father, or husband to the cause of freedom. Their service never ended. They lived with that loss till their final days. So who were these men? They were Americans from all walks of life, and you will hear all of their names read later in the honor roll, but I would like to tell you a little about a few of these American heroes. Most of them rest in cemeteries in Europe, like the Somme American Cemetery or the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery in France. Many of them were young men who had no children, no one to remember them, so today all of us will do just that. Edwin E. Paul was a private born and raised in White Plains who belonged to the 107th Infantry Regiment and the 27th Division. He was killed in action on September 29, 1918, on the first day of the Battle of Saint-Quentin Canal in Rancy, France, and is buried at the Somme Cemetery. Paul received a Distinguished Service Cross for heroism in action. He exposed himself to danger many times to save the lives of others. Once during open fire to drag a fellow officer out of the path of fire, and again when a corporal was injured and bound to die, he ran to go save him. It was while he was bandaging up this corporal that he was struck in the stomach and died. He was an inspiration to his brother John, who named his son after his heroic brother. Robert M. Davis of White Plains was also a private in the 107th Infantry. Davis died in August of 1918 at the age of 23. He and his company received a citation for their actions at the Third Battle of Ypres. Davis was recognized for gallantry and determination in advancing over an open field under heavy enemy fire at the time of a raid on frontline trenches, for which he and his compatriots were commended by the British commander. Because of the heroic works of the 107th Infantry, a memorial was built in Central Park and is visible for all to see at 5th Avenue and 67th Street. Zygmunt Schroeder was born in 1895 in Grozhewo, Russia, now part of Poland. After moving to New York, he lived in White Plains. He was a private first class in the U.S. Army, who died on September 28, 1918, 9 months after his enrollment. He was killed in action in what was one of the deadliest battles ever fought, the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. This battle alone killed over 26,000 people, and even though there was much bloodshed, this battle helped end World War because it was a great American victory. Schroeder is buried in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. Thomas W. Brown was a private from White Plains in Company G of the 369th Infantry, which was mostly African American, called the Harlem Hellfighters. First organized in 1916 as the 15th New York National Guard Infantry Regiment, and manned by black enlisted soldiers with both black and white officers, the 369th was the best-known African-American unit of World War I. In 1917, it prepared for service in Europe and arrived in Brest, France in December. Thomas Brown was killed in action in France on July 31, 1918. The regiment spent over 6 months in combat, perhaps the longest of any American unit in the war. The 369th suffered approximately 1,500 casualties, and well over 100 members of the regiment received American and/or French medals. There isn't enough time to tell you about every man memorialized here today, but each and every name you will hear on the honor roll served just as honorably as these men I have told you about. They all gave their lives for our freedoms. By the time of the armistice, more than 4 million Americans had served in the armed forces, and 116,708 had lost their lives. On the home front, millions of women went to work replacing the men who shipped off to war, while others knitted socks and made bandages. During the war, White Plains citizens raised money for the Liberty and Victory loan bonds of nearly $8 million, $1 million more than was requested. World War I was the foundation for many things we still remember today. The American Legion was founded by these veterans, and the Legion Auxiliary by their families to support those veterans, just as we still do today. Armistice Day, later known as Remembrance Day in the Commonwealth and Veterans Day in the United States, is commemorated every year on November 11th to mark the armistice signed at Compiègne, France, for the cessation of hostilities on the Western Front, which took effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. Memorial Day reminds us of the poppies that watch over our dead. Shortly after the war, the founder and commander of the White Plains American Legion Post 135, Frederick Gross, had first proposed the idea of planting oak trees in honor of the White Plains men who died while in service in World War I. The Legion and the veterans of foreign wars joined in raising funds of $1,500, worth $25,000 today. The dedication took place November 11, 1921, on Armistice Day. The parade featured veterans of the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and World War I. Half a ton of soil from the Bayeux Wood battleground in France to mix with the soil at this memorial was brought to America by two young French women, Mademoiselles Jean Petit and Elaine Cayes, as well as a French flag and a letter that said, "We have learned with deep interest that the men of White Plains who fought in the Great War intend to plant a tree on Armistice Day in honor of their brave comrades who died for our beloved France. We feel that the mingling of soil from the spot where your brave comrades fought to save our country and civilization with the soil of America is symbolic of the bonds of affection which unite our two motherlands. The citizens of Chateau Thierry will ever cherish the memory of the men from America who drove the enemy from their town." In 1927, the Parkway Commission recommended that the trees be relocated to make room for the county center, which was under construction. After 1.5 years of discussion, a committee made up of members of the American Legion, veterans of foreign wars, and the Memorial Tree Committee agreed to relocation and suggested that the old nameplates be replaced by bronze plaques set into stone monuments at the base of each tree, which we are rededicating today. In 1931, the newly transplanted trees and new plaques were dedicated at a ceremony on Memorial Day. But over time, they were moved, stored, separated, and forgotten until several years ago when Dan Griffin, the current commander of Post 135, found them, had them cleaned, and replaced. Today, we hope that they will remain here for another 100 years. Remember, it is the soldier, not the poet, who gives us freedom of speech. It is the soldier, not the reporter, who gives us freedom of the press. It is a soldier, not the campus organizer, who gives us freedom to protest. It is a soldier who serves beneath the flag, who salutes the flag, and whose coffin is draped in that flag that gives demonstrators the right to burn the flag. It has been said that you die twice, once when you leave this earth, the second when they no longer say your name. Remember that each honor roll name you will hear today was a young man who lived, loved, served, and died too soon.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was great. You know, World War I ended, and the American Legion, the largest and the oldest serving veteran organization in the country, was founded. And we celebrated the American Legion's 105th convention, state convention here just about a week and a half ago. And at that particular time, with the good, gracious leadership and really initiative of our county exec, George Latimer, the county hosted that convention, which was at the Marriott and the Sleepy Hollow. And then on Friday night, the final day of the convention, we actually had the county host us again and performed a concert, a freedom concert, tribute to all of those heroes from the inception of our nation. And I went to the county executive and I suggested that we could probably host the convention here in Westchester County. They'd never been here before, and he said, "That's a great idea. Let's do it. They deserve it." And we, as Westchester County, with its rich heritage of military service and service to our nation, should do it. And with his leadership, we were able to put that together, which was very, very successful. So there's a lot of similarities between the American Legion, our history of World War I, dedication of these plaques, and I want to publicly, on behalf of all the good and grateful people of our community and all the veterans that are here today, we want to thank you, George, and ask you to come up and say a few words now.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's a great honor to be here today, to be part of this rededication ceremony. First, let me recognize some of the other elected officials or important appointed officials that are here today. They've taken time from their busy day as well to be part of this rededication. Let me recognize United States Congressman Michael Lawler, who's with us. Congressman. We have with us members of the Westchester County Board of Legislators here today. We have Margaret Kunzio, legislator, minority leader. We have Ben Boykin, legislator, immediate past chair of the board. We have Terry Clemens, Westchester County legislator, with us. And we have legislator Jewel Williams-Johnson with us as well. I'm not sure exactly where the district lines are between Ben and Jewel. We're in one of their districts, Jewel's district, so we give her the hometown credit for that moment. In a few minutes, you're going to hear the mayor of White Plains, Tom Roach, be part of reading of the names, and we're honored that he's here. We seem to be getting together every day for one reason or another. Mr. Mayor, it's an honor to be parked out in your community on an ongoing basis. Our Deputy County Executive Ken Jenkins is with us here today, as he always is on these things. And we appreciate the leadership of our commissioners in various departments. You'll hear her in a few minutes as well, but Kathy O'Connor heads up Parks, Recreation, and Conservation Department, and of course that's the department that manages the county center. We're also joined by Vincent Kopicki, who is Commissioner of our Department of Environmental Facilities. And I see that we have Commissioner Leonard Towns from our Department of Social Services as well. And if I've missed anyone that of that magnitude, please pull on my tail here. First Deputy Commissioner of Parks, Recreation, and Conservation, Peter Tartaglia, is also with us, and so many other people that do so much work day to day to day in making all of this operate. Cynthia's comments really don't need any further embellishment. I think what she said was brilliant, and it gives us the historical background. Sometimes I see her as the woman in charge of the Purdy House. Sometimes she is the matron in charge of the Miller House. But today, just as good old Cynthia Coffin, she leads us well in areas of patriotism and service to our veterans. Cynthia, it's always a pleasure to be with you in these things. And I know somewhere out there is Deb Palazzo, her sidekick. Together in Dahl, they do a tremendous job of keeping the spirit of Americanism alive. Just a few things to mention as part of all of this. We are here today because we are honoring a sacred commitment. There was a commitment that was made 100 years ago to honor these men that died, and that commitment was reestablished when we had to, because of the pandemic, take the prior physical plant here, the parking lot as it existed with the mature trees, and clear it out in order to create tents here to provide medical service and to take the floor of that county center and turn it into a hospital. For those fellows who work inside that building, it was a miracle to see it transformed from what it was to what it had to become, and then to be transformed back to what it is once again, a venue where we had the Freedom Concert just 2 weeks ago, and we've had other activities, and we'll continue to do it in that side, in that facility. But it was a commitment made by our forebears in county government. Before there was a county executive system, and before there was a board of legislators system, it was a board of supervisors in those days, and they made the commitment to honor those men who died in the First World War with these plaques. And we were duty-bound to restore them to their glory. Dan Griffin, thank you for making sure, along with Kathy O'Connor, that we honor that commitment this day with the rededication. I asked my father, who's passed on now over 25 years, when I was a young boy, what was it like? He was born in 1911, so he was a little boy during World War I. And it's kind of hard to imagine when I think that my father, were he alive today, he would be 112 years old, and at 112, he was only a little boy during the First World War. My mother's father, my grandpa Joe, left Harrison to serve in the First World War, and thank God he came back. Had he not come back, there would have been no mother, and then therefore no grandson to be standing here today. But my father told me a little bit about what that moment was like. Cynthia's talked about it in some ways, but the humanity of that moment included a host of different things that happened in the aftermath of the First World War to reach the point 100 years ago, or thereabouts, when these plaques were dedicated that we are rededicating today. And because World War II happened in such a short period of time afterwards, it's hard for those of us who come after that to remember how central the Great War was at that time in people's minds, and the horror of losing as many civilians as well as military people that died in that First World War, when it was only the Great World War. America, after that war, did in fact go through a terrible pandemic, the influenza pandemic. We also had a different spirit in America. Not only was the American Legion created in the aftermath of the First World War, but so were service clubs like Kiwanis, Lions, and Rotary, all created in the 4 to 5 years after the Great World War. The scouting movement, Boy Scouts and then subsequently Girl Scouts, got their great boost in those years after World War I. And of course, the Roaring Twenties, the decade in which my mother came along, and perhaps because it was the Roaring Twenties, we had a tremendous boost of enthusiasm and economic growth in America, leading to the Great Depression. My parents and anybody in my age cohort who talk to their parents talk about the enthusiasm of what happened surviving that First World War and then what the Great Depression meant, followed by an even greater war with even greater loss of life in the Second World War. These are sobering things to think about in our current day. And when we rededicate ourselves to the sacrifice that these men made, we remind ourselves that the battles that they fought for are never over. They had to be refought in the Second War, and they had to be refought for the principles that put us in Korea and Vietnam and in the Middle East. Those principles are still in effect today, and now we turn to young men and women of the current day, and we ask them to be prepared to make similar sacrifice to the sacrifice that these men made, and in this case, the ultimate sacrifice. Now, everybody that was alive in that day has passed away. Those that served, those that didn't serve, those that were on the home front, those that came home safely. The whole generation of that day is gone. I had a Saturday in 1980. I was in my professional career as a salesman. I was in a hotel setting in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and we were trying to book a group of World War I veterans. And all of these gentlemen, as best as I can recall, were in their 80s, some were in their 90s, and I was the tender age of 26 that many years ago, 40 some odd years ago. And my job was to tour the property with them, then to have lunch with them, buy them lunch, about 12 of them, and talk about what the nature of the convention would be, and we ultimately got the booking. But of course, after we did the business for the convention, they told stories. And I sat there and I listened as a 26-year-old to 80-year-old men remembering when they were 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22, when they left the farms that they were in or the small jobs that they had to go overseas and to be in Paris and to fight in that First World War. And it was a personal understanding of the sacrifice. And these were the men that came back. And these men, strong men, who survived the Depression, whose sons, my father's generation, were in World War II. And at that table, they cried. I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe what I was seeing. The emotion was that great because the sacrifice was that great. When we rededicate these plaques today and we hear the names called, as Cynthia said, these were young men. These were men who had the whole life ahead of them. And they sacrificed them on a field in France or wherever they forfeited their life. And then just 20 years, 25 years later, the next generation of Americans had to make the same sacrifice. And a few years after that in Korea, the sacrifice. And now men who are in their mid to late 70s made that sacrifice in the Mekong Delta. That's what America's about. America's not about the two-party system per se. It's not about how economically strong we are. It is. Our capitalistic system is the greatest economic system in the world. The fact that we have a democracy, no matter how fractious and contentious it is, makes us that much far ahead of so many other governments that are ruled by one person, whatever the type of totalitarian it is. But America is about Americans ready to sacrifice, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. Just as those men who signed that Declaration of Independence, they put their lives and their sacred honor on that document. They were committing treason under the rules of England, but they stood up for America as well. If we have a message from today, the rain held up, the Almighty has kindness upon us once again. That this America is not a battle that was won in 1918 with the armistice. It wasn't won in 1945 with the cessation of hostilities. It wasn't won when they had the 1953 truce that goes on till today. It wasn't won when Saddam Hussein left Kuwait. It's never won. It's always in play. It's in play in everything we do. At every level of government, democracy is in play. And the only question is, as we remember our dedication today with these plaques, will we remember that dedication every single day? And will we pass on that dedication to our children and now our grandchildren? And that's the only way America survives in the years to come.
Thank you, George. We're about to read the names of all the World War I's veterans who sacrificed. And before we do that, I think part of the history is the poem Flanders Fields. And Michael, if you would be good enough to explain the history of poppies and why they're sold at Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and so on. Come on up.
Good afternoon. There's an old expression out there, that's a tough act to follow. And Mr. Latimer's comments and Cynthia's comments are some of the comments that I wanted to preface the reading of in Flanders Field with. But I want to add a couple of comments. The author of the poem, John McCrae, was a lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Army. He fought in the Boer Wars, and he came out a major, eventually got to lieutenant colonel, and his dying words were, why did you want to enlist in World War I rather than be a battlefield surgeon, which you are now. And he said this: surgeons don't win wars, infantrymen do. So I think when we read the poem, you'll get a little better flavor for what John McCrae said. What Mr. Latimer said about World War I being the wars that would end all wars, I'd like to tell you a little known fact. There was a man in Versailles, and his name was Ho Chi Minh. He was a young man, and he begged the people who ran Versailles to do something about the colonialism that was going on in his country from the country of France, who hosted Versailles. He was ignored. You can trace, obviously, World War I to me is just an extension of, World War II is just an extension of one. Vietnam is the result of ignorance of what Ho Chi Minh requested. Everything in the Near East is an extension of the same problem. I'd like to add just a little something to what Cynthia said. At the beginning of World War I, there was a lady by the name of Moyna Michael. And Moyna lived in Georgia. She was in Europe at the time that the war broke out, and she was instrumental in getting a lot of Americans out of Europe and out of danger. She had a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia. She continued her studies, and she went to Columbia for her master's and her doctorate. After the war was over, she saw the value of the symbol of the poppy. And she started a factory in Georgia with veterans who were disabled making the poppies. And from there, the auxiliary of the American Legion spotted what was going on and took that project on as theirs, which is where it is today. The poem is not like a poem that you know as a child. For instance, with Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. The sentences don't end in the same word, but there are words in the poem that are the same. And that figure of speech is called alliteration. A wonderful example of alliteration is in My Fair Lady, when Audrey Hepburn figures out that she can speak in the King's language versus her Cockney, where she grew up. The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain. And Rex Harrison and everybody else is jubilant that she's done that. That's a perfect example of alliteration. The poem was written after, in 1915, after John McCrae had lost a friend. And he sat on the tailgate of an ambulance watching this young man being buried in Flanders Fields and wondered, why do the poppies grow here? And is this kid's loss of life worthwhile? And what can I do to make sure that it's perpetuated? There are lots of great poets from World War I, Rudyard Kipling being one. Kipling lost a son in the war. But this poem lasts longer than any other poem of World War I. And so I would like to read to you the pleas and the lament of John McCrae. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders Fields. take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Michael. Michael is our American Legion historian throughout Westchester County and a lot of other things that we'd have to mention. Anyway, before we actually read the names, and I'm going to ask the mayor of White Plains, Tom Roach, to lead that off. But before we do that, I would ask Dan Griffin, who serves with us in the Veteran Service Agency. He's the commander of the post here in White Plains. And Dan, why don't you come up and give us a couple of words about some of the members that served in that post. And thank you for your service, too.
Thank you, Ron. Basically, when these plaques were returned, I went to County Exec George Latimer at the Memorial Day ceremonies, and I said, I'd like to have a rededication of these plaques for these men who lost their lives in World War I. And right away, George Latimer called over the Parks Commissioner, Kathleen O'Connor, and said, why don't we get this done? And here we are. It's done. And thanks to her crackerjack staff, those guys over there, they got it done, including their foreman, happens to be their foreman, who happens to be my son-in-law. Great job, guys. Thank you.
We're going to read the names. I'm going to ask everyone if they can to stand as we honor them. And I'm going to ask Mayor Roach to begin by reading the names of those on the list. You have that?
Yeah. Thank you, Ron. I just wanted to note that we're joined by Brian Wallach, and during that terrible time of COVID, I was in contact with the county every day on different issues, and we were working to do our part to get this hospital set up as quickly as possible. And Brian called me to remind me about the trees and the plaques to make sure they would be replaced when this was over, and the county, we all agreed absolutely, and here we are today. Just one comment I want to make is that in City Hall, when you come in, our City Hall is the War Memorial or the Veterans Memorial of the City of White Plains. And before you enter the council chambers, there are images of most of the men who gave their lives for our country in World War I. And I was always particularly interested in one because of those images displayed, the only black soldier. And when I became mayor, I began researching him. And I'll just briefly tell you what I found. You can't find everything on the internet. I had to write a letter to the Army, and then they wrote back to me, yes, we have records. There was a fire and a flood. We don't know how good they're going to be, but they're $60. I said, here you go. He was in his 30s. He was working for the railroad. He was well liked by his co-employees. He enlisted. He went to serve his country and wanted to fight for his country, despite the fact that his country was not recognizing his rights and would not permit him to fight for his country. So he was attached to the French army with the Harlem Hellfighters. He was when I got the records, I had them translated. The medical records are in French because he was with the French army. He sustained a gunshot wound near the end of the war. From my non-medical analysis, it was the infection more than the gunshot that finally took his life. He was moved over to American Care, American Hospital at the end, and he passed away. What the records indicated, his wife passed away the same day, and that he had a daughter. The daughter, the last record in the file is an American Legion post in New Jersey where the daughter had gone to live with an aunt, arguing to the Army that she was not getting her fair share of what she should be getting. So that, I think, to everyone's point, these were people that gave their lives, gave up so much for us, and it's never to be minimized. And Other one that I immediately recognize, and for another reason I know very little about, Stuart Kent. If you're in Grace Church, one of the windows in there, and it's a very sad window. Everyone in the stained glass is very somber, and it was donated by his mother in his memory. So with that, I will now read the names to which I have been assigned, and I thank you all for being here to honor these men for what they did for us. Joseph M. Alois, William M. Beyer, Irving Blaustein, Thomas Brown, Francis J. Buckley, James J. Cleary, Frederick W. Cobb, Ralph L. Cook, Peter Coombs, Thomas R. Cullington, Robert M. Davis, James Hugh Drumgold, William P. Earl Jr., Arlo E. Garnsey, Irving S. Gedney, Robert Hammer, Lorenzo O. Haskell, Henry L. Hatfield.
Commissioner Kathy O'Connor, read the next.
Thank you, Ron. I also would like to just add my thank you to the staff at the County Center, particularly Veronica Snyder and Bill Schoenberg. Bill is over there on the right, grabbing this and really running with it, working closely with Dan Griffin, and obviously, of course, Peter Tartaglia, who oversaw it and also oversees the County Center. So thank you. Beautiful job, as always. William E. Heim, Jr., John E. Hendrickson, Charles C. Herman, Donald P. Honeywell, Stuart Kent, Frederick S. Longyear, Enrico Lucarelli, Michael Lundy, Henry P. Lynch, Arthur J. Magnan, Bernard J. McElroy, John P. O'Neill, Joseph F. O'Neill, Lester Parks, Felix H. Pezzold, Edwin E. Paul, Herman J. Pepper.
Dan, would you finish the names?
Lester Parks, Felix H. Patzoid, Edward E. Paul, Herman J. Pepper, Louis F. Plummer, Zygmunt Schroeder, Edward L. Skelly, Gennaro Seco, Clarence A. Smith, John Smith, Patrick Sullivan, Madison R. Timbrook, Ralph R. Tompkins, Charles W. Toombs, Frederick Wallington, Walter Williams, and Victor Zaki.
We'll have a rifle salute conducted by Eastchester Sam DiRenzo Post, and followed that with taps by Russ Ebersol. That concludes our service for today. Special thanks, acknowledging all those veterans in the audience. God bless you. Take care of each other. God bless America. Thank you.